Thank you everyone for joining today. And as Jennifer said, this is new to everyone. The agency just popped this on employers effective November 30th, and it's not been without controversy. In fact, there's currently a lawsuit by business interest groups against the agency trying to challenge some of these protocols that we're talking about today. And who knows how that's going to turn out. But if you're somewhat miffed about the suddenness and expansiveness of these regulations, you're in good company. And we expect to see more developments, more guidance, more information on these regulations as the days and weeks move forward. And I'll certainly be monitoring that. And my colleagues who specialize in workplace safety in particular will be looking at that. Now, my focus, we've got, at our firm, we do have some attorneys that focus on OSHA and Cal OSHA matters. And I've been deferring to them, to their level of expertise on this, but I have been carefully monitoring what they're saying about these new regulations, and I hope to bring some of those thoughts to you today. But again, in the absence of a lot of answers to challenging questions, because the regulations are just what they are, and there's not much detail beyond what the regulations just say themselves, I thought the most effective approach would be to walk you through some of the sections of the regulations and highlight some of the concerns or some of the compliance issues and help you at least get started on complying with the major components of the law. And if I can't get all the questions answered, it's not for lack of trying, it's just probably for lack of information. So I wanted to just cover some basic topics, the implementation of the regulations, what they cover, some of the definitions and the requirements, including a COVID-19 prevention plan, testing, what it means when we're speaking in terms of outbreaks, and some other compliance issues. We'll try to touch on some frequently asked questions, probably some of your questions as well. So as a starting point, these regulations apply to most employers and most places of work, except locations where one employee does not have contact with other persons. So if you got one person working remotely or in isolation, then the purpose of these regulations is to protect against the spread of the virus. And if there's only one person, they can't spread it to themselves. They can go out somewhere else and get it, I suppose, but they're not going to then come into your workplace and give it to someone else. People working from home, same idea. They're not coming into your workplace, so you don't have any control over the environment, and it's not your obligation to impose the requirements of these regulations on people working at home. And then certain employees, and unfortunately I don't have a lot of time to get into this today, but you're already regulated by other Cal OSHA requirements, such as healthcare workers, people in nursing homes and hospitals and so forth. If you're in that industry, you already know this, there's super extra diligent protections and expectations with respect to personal protective equipment and other healthcare protocols. And so these regulations are intended to apply to the not healthcare environment. Now, before you start panicking, don't, because I think by now, if you've been paying attention since March of this year, you probably have a lot of these components already in place, at least to some extent, because these regulations incorporate a lot of the measures that employers have already been taking. You've been following the CDC guidelines, I hope. You've been complying with the San Diego County Health Department's rules and the state of California's Department of Public Health's rules and guidances that have been published and have been updated periodically throughout most of this year, including things like screening for symptoms and telling employees not to come to work if they have symptoms. What are the testing protocols if someone becomes ill, undoubtedly you've engaged in at least some communications with your employees regarding these expectations and perhaps even some training. You've been requiring them at a minimum to wear face masks in the work environment and engage in physical distancing and other workplace hygiene measures. And so to the extent you already have those in place, you might already be pretty good with a lot of the requirements of these regulations. So this is a layer, or maybe a boost to what you've already been doing. And I think there's certainly the layer of enforcement behind all of these regulations that may have been absent before now. Now that we've got the Workplace Safety Agency in the state of California empowered to enforce these regulations, there potentially could be citations and other enforcement measures taken against your business. Whereas there wasn't really a collective effort to do that in a widespread basis by local county authorities or even state authorities. You've heard incidental incidents probably in the news about such and such business was targeted by the local authorities for opening in, blatant violation of the closure orders and so forth, but not a systematic approach. This gives the agency, the OSHA agency, that power to enforce. So what are the elements of the COVID prevention plan? Well, so first of all, just sort of, I'd say, framework-wise, you're probably already a little bit familiar with the sort of concept we're referring to now, because you already have an injury and illness prevention plan, or should have one, that's of general applicability to safety issues in your workplace. So that's a document, and it lists out various procedures and protocols that you have in place in your workplace, generally to keep people safe. Well, this is the same idea. It's a prevention plan, but it's COVID specific. And this is a document that the regulations say you should prepare, customize, distribute, and closely follow. And most of what the regulations do is highlight or outline what it is those requirements are. And what you need to do is take those requirements and decide how they would apply specifically in your work environment and what measures you need to take in order to comply with the general parameters. Now, if I can swing this web page into the presentation, this is the OSHA's website on COVID-19. If you were to go into your search engine and just type OSHA and COVID-19, you'd come upon this page. It's dir.ca.gov/DOSH/coronavirus. And you won't often hear me say this about government websites, but this one's relatively helpful and somewhat straightforward as far as reading. So here's your homework assignment. Take note of this website and take an hour or so to read through the materials here and familiarize yourself with what's on here. Beyond attending this presentation and finding other legal publications on the topic, I think this is a good resource for you to familiarize yourself with the requirements. So this first box that I've got the pointer on right now, you click on that, you'll get to see the standards that I'm talking about today. And it goes on for 21 or 22 pages of specifications. The second box has more industry specific expectations, and those documents have been online before now. And had you made your way to the California COVID-19 website or the Department of Public Health website, you would have seen some industry specific guidelines. Click on that. And so I'm just scrolling down it real quickly, but you can see here on the screen, there's a bunch of different industries listed here by bullet point. And let's just pick construction, for example. You click on that and it'll take you to, well, hello. It's not taking me anywhere, but these links should be taking you to specific information about whatever industry you're in, and you get more specific guidances regarding COVID-19 safety in your workplace. The FAQ page also has information regarding the code sections we're talking about today. And honestly, I would say that the FAQ on these regulations is helpful, but it basically just sort of mirrors the regulation. I don't really see anything in here that isn't specifically quoted in the regulations. They boil it down a little bit more, and it's a little easier to read than if you were to look at the regulations. It looks like a code book, and you've got to have your legal brain activated to kind of understand how this sections really integrate. This is more of a normal language, not lawyer language, summary of the requirements. And it's also not 21 pages long. So I would say if you're going to read anything on the website, this would be a good one to go to. And again, I'm going to get through some of these details in just a moment. I'm just giving you the high level view of this. And then they have educational materials, fact sheets, videos, and fillable written safety plans, which is kind of where I was getting to with respect to this coronavirus prevention plan. So first of all, they've got videos for workforces. They've got posters, education information you can hand out, and model plans, model written plans and programs. So you do not have to create your corona plan from scratch. You can start with the government's outline, but when you open it up, you'll see it's very generic. You're going to need to go through and fill in information specific to your workplace. So that is your homework assignment too. And they have it in, I see it here in English, and I don't see that they posted it in Spanish, and maybe it'll be a while before that happens. But in any event, this is where your starting point can be with these model plans. And so webinars, I haven't actually watched any of them. I haven't had time yet. But it's on different topics, some of which may not be applicable to you. Online training courses for employers and workers. That's the bottom box here. I don't know what my web browser is doing. It's being a little slow today, but this is where you would get training materials. So we're gonna talk about that in a minute. You got to give training to yourself and to your employees. Here we go. All right, so there's one 24 minutes for businesses, and then in 1 second for your employees, and it looks like they got Spanish versions of the same thing. Right, so when you say, oh my gosh, we got to do training, well, some of this is already ready-made for you, thankfully. Okay, so move this out of the way for a second. All right, so we're going back to the elements of this COVID-19 program, and what are the elements? Well, there's actually 11 of them. And I don't have 11 bullet points here, but I've got the major components here. You've got to come up with a communication plan, get information to your employees. You've got to have a system for identifying and investigating hazards related to COVID-19 transmission, a plan for correcting those at the workplace. As I mentioned a minute ago, training your employees so they know what they're expected to do. There's a plan that covers what you probably are doing with respect to physical distancing, face coverings, engineering controls such as plexiglass and HVAC modifications and all that good stuff, and so forth. And then reporting and record keeping obligations, which we'll discuss in just a minute. So looking specifically at then that communication element, what the plan asks you to do is come up with a method for communicating to your employees with a method for reporting symptoms, exposures, and hazards, procedures and policies for accommodating at-risk employees. So that would be someone, for example, that's in a is medically sensitive to COVID because of underlying health conditions, and what you might be able to do to assist them, for example, relocating them to a more isolated part of the facility, or in some cases even having them work remotely, giving them additional protective equipment, and so forth. The communication should also address testing information for employees, and we're going to talk about testing in just a moment. But basically, if there's going to be COVID in the workplace, these regulations are telling you that you need to pay for testing for the employees who were exposed to the positive test. And then the communication plan also addresses how to communicate COVID hazards. How can you communicate it? Well, there's a bunch of different ways, and it's all sort of common sense approaches. So bulletin boards and job site postings. And I know a lot of employers these days have the virtual bulletin board, the intranet. So they have a company specific website where people can go to get information. You can post your prevention plan there, circulate memos, you can have safety meetings and verbally provide the information either through online or in person, weekly calls or other gatherings where this information can be distributed, Q&A sessions, recorded materials that people can watch in video form or recorded audio form, something like that. Or maybe all of the above. I would say the more you do, the better. You're likely to have employees complying with the COVID-19 prevention protocols. And I've been hearing a lot lately because of the widespread outbreak in the community of COVID-19 about some employees are being rather cavalier about some of these requirements, and they let their guard down, and then before you know it, you've got cases in your workplace. And many of the calls I get from employers, they have no idea where the source of it came from. It's just someone randomly picked it up unknowingly and innocently. But I'm also hearing stories about people who are disregarding the hygiene and masking and distancing requirements, and or they're when they're off the clock, they're disregarding the stay-at-home order and doing foolish things like attending big gatherings and so forth, and then bringing the illness into the workplace that way. So the communication plan isn't just a check the box type approach where we have the documentation, but we don't really put any teeth into it or really any strong effort to emphasize with our employees the importance of this. No, I think that the purpose of this is to really get employees to understand the need to comply with all of these protocols. So think of a way to communicate this, and I'm imagining a lot of employers these days are going with the internet version because that's the easiest way to reach everyone, even if they're not in the work environment. That said, though, you need to have a printed form of the COVID-19 prevention plan available at your facility, at your office, in the event that you get a compliance check from the Cal OSHA agency. It won't be good enough for you just to say, well, it's on our internet, we have it posted there. They're going to demand and are entitled to a printed copy of the document. So that's not too hard. Just have a hard printed copy somewhere in your file and ready to pull it out if necessary. So that's communication. What else? So another element is identification and evaluation of the workplace. So you're required to establish processes and policies and procedures to initially and periodically, repeatedly identify and evaluate COVID-19 hazards in the workplace. For example, you do a walkthrough and you see that certain workstations are closer than 6 feet together, so maybe we need to distance them. Or there's a ventilation problem in one department, or we should be putting up plastic dividers in certain sections, distributing masks and hand sanitizers, so on and so forth, posting information. But what, inspection of the workplace, and then what do we need to do to make it ready for employees? Again, if you haven't done this by now, since March, I'm a little surprised, but this makes it official in the regulations. Okay, so again, screening, ventilation I mentioned. Consider any industry unique aspects to identifying particular COVID risk. Restaurants have a different concern than an office building with administrative staff, or a warehouse might be different than an assembly facility, or a retail store. And as the bottom of this slide indicates, you can't just do it once and then say, that's it. The regulations expect you to periodically repeat this and just check to see if anything has changed in the workplace and there's any way to identify any new issues relating to COVID-19. And yeah, of course, you're going to want to have a record. You're going to want to, first of all, delegate who are the responsible people who are going to be doing this review. And I would suggest having some sort of record, some sort of log, something that indicates that this evaluation took place, what the outcome of the evaluation is, what steps were taken, and then, again, the periodic revisiting of those on a regular basis. I think the business that does that and then has a visit from Cal OSHA is going to pass with flying colors. Business who says, yeah, we kind of did that, but I can't really tell you what we did, when we did it, how we did it, then I think that's going to raise the bureaucrats' eyebrows, and maybe they're going to decide we need to dig into this one a little deeper to see what they're really doing. You don't want the deep dig. You want to be able to show them that you've accomplished what's expected in the CPP. All right, so then the next element has to do with investigation. This is talking about if there's a case or a suspected case in the workplace, you've got protocols you're going to follow to follow up and figure out who was exposed and record facts regarding the positive test and the exposure and the process that you took to investigate all of that. Excuse me. All right, so the first aspect, of course, if you have information indicating there's a positive test case in the work environment, is you want information down. Joe Smith has a positive test. When were they in the workplace in relation to when they were diagnosed? That's super important, right? If you're going to figure out who all was exposed to Joe Smith, you need to pin down the details of the chronology. Let's find out what date he got the positive test, and then let's backtrack and figure out before that, when was he in the workplace, where was he in the workplace, who came in contact with him. Because their next step is going to be notifying everyone that was exposed in that person's work environment and letting them know. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. And of course, everything we're talking about, you're going to document your process. So there'll be some file notes indicating what you learned in the process of this investigation. So what is exposure? I think the key takeaway, the key term that I'm hearing my OSHA colleagues use for memory purposes, 6-15-25. If you remember 6-15-25, then you know what the rule is. So it's within 6 feet for a cumulative total of 15 minutes or more in any 24-hour 24-hour period. Sometimes it seems like there are 25 hours in a day, but no, it's 6-15-24. A little typo there on the screen. So when I say cumulative 15 minutes, so you could be exposed to someone for 10 minutes now, but then you round it out with another 5 later on, and now you're in the money with respect to being exposed to the person. But something less than a cumulative 15 minutes, I'm not saying it. I don't think medical professionals would say it's impossible for you to acquire the virus in less than 15 minutes. They're just saying the probabilities of contracting it from a positive case in your immediate vicinity is higher if your exposure is 15 minutes or longer. So basically you were in close proximity for 15 minutes and then you're exposed to a COVID-19 case during the high risk exposure period. This is just specification about, well, when is it, if someone tested positive, when is it that they're going to be infecting other people? And so the regulations put some parameters around that. They say, well, it's 2 days before they were positive tested, because the doctors are saying if they got the positive test, that they didn't start transmitting the disease to others the moment they got the positive test. We got to rewind the tapes and figure out when they probably became sick and infecting others. And they're saying it's 2 days, 2 days back. I think the assumption is you start to feel sick usually, and that's what prompts you to get a test, or you were exposed to someone else. And it's likely that in the 2 days before that, you maybe had the virus in your system, didn't even know you were, or even feel sick, but you were contagious at that point in time. So it's 2 days before and 10 days after a positive test. The idea being, well, okay, there's a longer period where your body's immune system is ramping up and is trying to combat the virus, and you should be clear of the illness within 10 days in most normal circumstances, right? So you need to go and figure out, well, what are the 2 days before and what are the 10 days after the positive test of the person with the positive case? And now we got to go figure out who had exposure by being within 6 feet for 15 or more minutes during any 24-hour period, during the high risk exposure period, right? So that's going to go back, that's going to cover a 12-day period probably, right? Depending on when the person was or was not in the workplace, it could be as long as that. So that depending on how mobile the person is in the workplace, they could get into a lot of parts of your workplace in that period of time, conceptually. And that takes me back to the idea of your workplace protocols. I've talked to some businesses who have sort of cordoned off their business. I was talking to one the other day. Maybe she's even on the line. I haven't checked to see who the attendees are, but I'm sure she won't mind me at least generically referencing this example. They've got an accounting department and they've got a repair facility, and they don't interact with each other directly. The accounting department never goes onto the floor. The workers on the floor never go into the accounting department. They're isolated from each other. Someone needs to drop off paperwork, they do it, they drop it into a bin outside the accounting department. And there's even protocols for hygiene as far as the transfer of documents, but they don't interact. So if there's a outbreak in the accounting department, we're not going to be worried about the accounting department employees exposing themselves, their illness rather, to the people on the floor, the repair floor. And that goes back to sort of organizing your workplace in a way that's going to limit the breadth of the exposure, and then ultimately limit who you have to test, who you have to send home, who you have to pay for, and potentially limiting the spread to just maybe a couple people rather than shutting down your entire facility. Now, if there is a positive case in the workplace, then you have a notice obligation, and you have to act quickly. You have to give notice to anyone who is exposed in that area within 1 day. You have to let them know that they could have been exposed to a positive case. And I think you've been doing this since March, because there's been guidance from the government since then in different ways indicating to you the need to do this. And there's also a new law coming up, but that's not effective until a few days from now, January 1st. Right, so we've got the guidances from before now. We've got these new regulations as of November 30th saying you have to give this notice in 1 day, and then we've got this new law coming in place in a few days. But the bottom line in all of them is you've got to give notice to the people exposed without identifying the person. For privacy reasons, you don't list the name of the person, but you let the exposed people know that someone in their work environment has tested positive, and you're recommending that they're taking steps to perhaps get tested and to quarantine themselves if they have symptoms or have a positive test. When it says include notification of authorized representatives, that's taken from the code, but it basically means if you're a unionized setting, you've got the shop steward or the other union representatives who are going to get this information too, even if they weren't in the vicinity and they're not in the exposed workplace. Would also include any outsiders like independent contractors or other employees at a work site. Of course, this is a written document. I see it distributed electronically. In any way that you can verify that employees will receive this information is fine. But you definitely want to preserve your record that you've done this notification. If I were you, to have a form ready to go and just fill in the details. Now, this is a new one for these regulations. You've got to offer free testing to those exposed at work. You don't just tell them you can go to your own doctor and get testing, or you can go to one of the public testing places and get testing. It's fine and great for you to tell that, but you've also got to offer to them, we have free testing available for you. Now, whether they get tested through your free offer of testing or not.
So it's not enough just to investigate and determine who has been exposed and given these notices, but then you're supposed to go back and try and figure out, was there anything about the work environment that could have been done or should now be done to correct the hazard? In this example, we've got someone that sends an email to a supervisor saying that employees are gathering in the break area without masks on and social distancing. And she's concerned about this. So Tasha would want to look into that. She'd want to document that they responded, that they communicated with those people gathering in the break area without masks on and corrected their behaviors. Next slide. It should say training.
Yep.
So this is what I talked about before with respect to training on your policies and procedures. The benefits on the screen, that would be the sick pay, would be workers' comp pay, would be any state disability benefits, and so forth. And training on all the obvious stuff like physical distancing, hand washing, and face coverings. And so as I pointed out at the beginning of the presentation, there's materials online that you can use, but you could also customize that and present that to your employees. The agency's example, I'm doing this from memory, but I think it was just 15 minutes or so. So it's not a big deal to go through this, but you do want to document that you've actually done the training. Just think of it like as you do for your harassment prevention training. You keep a log or a record showing that you've complied with the training requirement. Next slide. The other element of the coronavirus prevention program is physical distancing, personal protective equipment, and so forth. And this, again, this is stuff that you've already been doing, unless you've been from another planet until yesterday. And so you're probably in good shape here, but now that the regs are in place, it'd be a good time to go back and double check and make sure you haven't drifted out of compliance. Next slide. So face coverings. Face coverings, face coverings, face coverings. That's all we seem to talk about these days. But the new thing about these regulations is you are supposed to provide face coverings. Now, that doesn't mean you have to say to your employee upon arrival in the morning, stop wearing the Christmas-themed face covering that you got from home and put on one of our blue surgical masks. I'm just saying you need to have them available in the workplace for people to use. Just have a box of face coverings at various stations throughout the workplace that people can grab when they need them, and restock them, of course, as the supplies get depleted. Face shields generally are not acceptable for a replacement for face coverings unless the person has some sort of documented medical condition that would prevent them from wearing a face covering. So clearly you need to be diligent about face coverings. Next slide. All the other environmental controls falls under the and more. And the upside down triangle is a general Cal OSHA, I guess, approach to things. Eliminating the risk, replacing the hazard, isolating people, changing the way they work, or giving them protective gear to protect them from the exposure. That's generic, like any toxic, exposure in the workplace, right? For COVID, it's the same philosophy. Separating people out, changing the ventilation in the place, cleaning out the facility, eliminating shared equipment or wiping it down between uses, hand washing and instructions to customers on how they're supposed to behave in the workplace. All those are intended to be outlined in your plan. Next section, next slide. Leave. Now we arrive at the most controversial, at least as far as my clients are concerned, section of the regulations. The regulations state that you're supposed to, in the event that you exclude any worker from the workplace because of COVID-19, you're supposed to pay them. You say, Chris, well, that's not controversial. I'm either covered by the FFCRA or I'm already covered by the California sick pay law. And I'm already giving sick pay to employees when they get COVID or are exposed to COVID, have to go home. Right, but this is open-ended. It's not just 2 weeks. It's every time and all occasions that you're sending people home. Let's say they already blew through their sick pay in July, and now you're sending them home because they were exposed once again. According to these regulations, you've got to continue basically paying them annual sick pay every time you send them home because of a COVID-19 exposure or illness. Now, that's a little bit outrageous for most businesses. And as you can imagine, this is part of the legal challenge that is being mounted against these regulations as we speak. And I don't know what the outcome of this is. The debate is, look, this is a health and safety regulation, and we're really tasked with keeping the environment safe, but this is a backdoor approach to sick pay. If the government wanted sick pay, they should go through the legislature, have it debated, and maybe even, how about giving some funding to employers to afford to do this? And so there's a lot of controversy around it. But for now, all I can tell you is it's in the regulations. If you send someone home and they don't have other pay available for their absence, and it's because of COVID exposure or the positive test, then these regulations say you're supposed to pay.
Now,
Next slide.
Chris, I'm sorry to interrupt on this, but this is a big one, obviously, for everybody. It does say that you can consider public funding or something, public benefit plans. So couldn't our employees file for disability and then you just supplement them with sick pay?
Maybe.
Great.
Did they get benefits, and how much? That would be the question, and then you got to top them off. The difference between what they get from the state and what they normally get paid. So, yeah, I mean, and I actually don't know what the government's doing these days. If someone doesn't have COVID, they've been exposed and they're in quarantine because we're just monitoring to see if they end up catching it. Is the government paying out disability benefits in that situation? Or do they need a medical note saying this person's actually ill, physically ill, and incapacitated from working because of that? I suspect the government's not paying for quarantine for someone who's not sick. But under these regulations, you, the employer, would. Anyway, this is, when I talked before about, this has been just kind of dropped like a load of bricks on employers, and there's not much guidance or rationale or, I guess, fairness even behind that. This is one of the sections I'm thinking of when I say that. All right, so going on to the next sections, reporting and record keeping. Go to the slide where there's the left side is white and the right part panel that says access is blue.
Yep, got it.
Okay, good. So the prevention plan shall be made available to employers, their authorized representatives, and Cal OSHA upon request. So post it on your internet, distribute it to your employees, and have a copy ready in case Cal OSHA comes knocking. You don't have to send it in proactively to Cal OSHA, but if they come ask for it, you got to be ready to give it to them. So you need to keep a record of all COVID-19 cases. Cases meaning someone with a positive test. This is private data. You're not telling this to your employees. This is not the 24-hour notice where you just say, hey, someone in the environment, you were exposed. This is an actual log of the positive cases, name, etc. All that data needs to be kept in a COVID-19 log for compliance purposes. There's companion laws coming out that you'll hear about in the legal update that require you to report information to your workers' comp carrier, and in some cases, in the event of an outbreak, reporting to the local public health agencies as well. So there's all sorts of reporting going on these days. But you're going to need this data to do the reporting. Next slide. As far as reporting, immediately upon request, provide information on your cases to the local health department, the California Department of Public Health, the Cal OSHA agency, the federal agency, and so this is why you need to keep your log and collect any medical records that you have access to, because they're going to, if they come and ask for this data, you're going to need to provide it very quickly, or you're going to get cited. Okay, so moving forward to the next section, return to work, and then there's a slide on excluding workers from the workplace. Again, you've been following these protocols since around March, right? So if someone either positive tests or has been exposed to someone with a positive test, you've been sending them home. And you've been following the CDC guidelines about, depending on whether they have symptoms or test positive, and or were they exposed to other people who had a positive test, you're sending them home between 10 to 14 days. Now, these rules in the regulation say 14 days is the quarantine period. Now, Jennifer, you go to the next slide, just because I wanted to reference this real quick. It says when close contact, there's an update. As of just a couple days ago, Governor Newsom issued an executive order, and he modified this 14-day rule that's in the regulations. People are pointing out, well, wait a minute, the California Department of Public Health actually has shorter time periods, and the CDC does too, so why are we saying 14 in the Cal OSHA regulations? Why indeed? So the governor issued an order saying, basically, if the California Department of Public Health has published standards that's less than the 14 days, you can follow the California Department of Public Health / CDC standards, and which they have at this point. There's not just across the board 14 days. The If you go to the California Department of Public Health, all symptomatic close contact cases may discontinue quarantine after day 10 from the date of last exposure with or without testing. So a close contact case where they don't get sick, they don't have symptoms, 10 days. There's even a rule that you'll see for where there's critical staffing shortages in essential businesses. It can be 7 days. You need to do a little research and figure out whether that applies to you or not. But again, the point being this 14-day rule that's in the regulations has been preempted by the governor's executive order. Okay, but other than that, the protocols are basically what you're already familiar with. Is when someone has symptoms, they need to isolate for at least 10 days, up to 10 days. I'm sorry, let me restate that. They need to isolate for 10 days since symptoms first appeared, and then they can come back when it's been at least 24 hours since they've had fever or other COVID-19 symptoms. The rules do not require a negative COVID-19 test to return to work, provided that you're following these isolation and quarantine protocols. Okay. Now, Jennifer, if you could advance a couple slides, the next title page is outbreaks, and then beyond that, I'm going to talk to you briefly about outbreaks. And then we're going to answer some questions. I know I'm sorry about the delay. We're a few minutes behind, and if everyone can indulge me, I'll finish the materials, and then we'll try to address some questions. All right, so are we on outbreaks, Jennifer? Okay.
Yes, sorry, I was muted. Yes, we are.
That's fine. So outbreaks, what is an outbreak? It depends on the circumstances, but the basic takeaway is when there's an outbreak in your workplace, then there's these additional measures that you need to take under these regulations. What are the two types of outbreaks? So it's either 3 or more cases in a 14-day period. Again, a case meaning a positive test, or a major outbreak, which is 20 or more cases in a 30-day period. I hope no one on the line has experienced that. That sounds bad. So if that happens, then there's mandatory testing of all exposed workers, exclusion, of course, of all exposed workers, mandatory reporting to the government, and then, as you would anyway, investigate and correct the problem. Now, next slide. Did Cal OSHA use the same outbreak definition as in SB 1159, the workers' comp amended law that requires you to report outbreaks to the government and to share data with your workers' comp administrator? No, they didn't use that definition. They kind of use the definition in AB 685, which is that new law coming into place on January 1st that requires you to distribute the written notice to employees in the event that there's exposure in the workplace. And so outbreak is it's the three or more cases within a 14-day period. But these two laws, one of them has a sort of the 1159 has a 4% of the workplace, or 4 more if you have 100 or fewer employees. Sort of confusing. Why didn't the government just have one definition of outbreak? I don't know. It's the government. That's not how they do it. So the next slide with the dark blue and light blue on it just has a side-by-side. You can look at this at your leisure when Jennifer sends you the slides, just to compare side-by-side how the two definitions of outbreak work. So regular outbreak and then a major outbreak. Now, there's a couple more slides that I'm going to pass by very quickly because I doubt anyone needs to worry about this. The next one says rules for employer-provided housing. If you're a company that provides housing for your employees, there are special rules. Just know that. I'm not going to cover them, but if you are, you need to study those. Next slide, rules for employer-provided transportation. Same thing, if you provide shuttle buses, or if you require your employees to work in work trucks or other vehicles together with other employees, then there's special rules regarding how you handle the vehicles. Take a look at those. They're on the website and so forth. It's basically just more hygiene, but instead of at a warehouse or an office building, it's inside the vehicle. Okay, next slide. Helpful checklists and top priorities. What do you need to do? So start compiling your data and put together your CPP. Obviously, match your tailored CPP to the elements that we've been covering today and that you'll see in the regulations. Get your training done. Start rolling out your documentation of all the steps, the training, communication, the implementation. Start putting together a file or a folder or a log or whatever it is that you're going to use to document that you've taken all of these steps. It'd be good to keep it all in one place. So in the event you need to quickly just get to it, let's say the government wants to know if you've been following the rules, you can just pull it out of the file. And then, of course, delegate responsibility. Some of you may have risk managers at your company. Some of you may not be that fancy. Someone should be in charge of all this to make sure that all the points are being hit. Those would be your top priorities. Next slide. We've collected some ideas from clients. Some of them I've mentioned. Some clients are saying they're really enhancing their screening and asking more detailed questions of their employees, especially during the holidays. Hey, you know, have you been traveling out of state? Have you been at big gatherings? You know, are employees honest about that? I don't know, but you kind of want to limit the spread in your workplace because of all these protocols you need to follow. Every time there's an outbreak, it's like a major undertaking for you to get through the process. So to the extent you're screening people out, that's better. More signage. Someone came up with the idea of color coding zones, like you work in the blue zone, this person works in purple, yellow, etc. And so when you need to you're defining work areas, the purple zone is, you know, separate from yellow, and people don't interchange between the two zones. That way, if we have an outbreak or even just an exposure in the purple zone, we're focusing only on people that came into the zone. It's just way easier to talk about that in terms of zones as opposed to trying to awkwardly refer to, well, the, you know, second floor, west side of the building, you know, the accounting department and whatever, the human resources department. It's just easier to say the purple zone. Companies are closing break rooms and lunch rooms and maybe forcing employees to go outside to have their breaks or their meals. That may not work at every facility, but some are considering that just so they don't want people congregating in break rooms. Same with bathrooms, maybe even limiting, depending on, I suppose, on the size of the bathroom, but perhaps limiting bathroom use to one at a time so that you don't, again, in some bathrooms, I know I've been to some of your facilities, you can't stand 6 feet apart from someone while you're in there. And so maybe you just limit it to one person at a time. Hopefully it doesn't cause a big line out the door. Jennifer, why don't you go to the last slide that says thank you, because I want to get to some people's questions. And if we don't have enough questions, then we can go back over some of the ones that I came up with. But I really do want to do my best.
Yeah, I think
we'll
have
enough. Some of the questions.
I think we have enough questions.
Okay. And by the way, I'm not going to be able to answer all of them because of time, and I'm not going to be able to answer all of them because I don't have all the answers.
Right.
I've just read the same materials you have, but we can maybe sort through some of these.
All right, so somebody says a Cal OSHA representative stated that a doctor's note is required for an employee to return to work after quarantine. So we see that isn't true, right? Can you already addressed that, didn't you, Chris? You can't require it. And here's the thing.
I mean, I'm surprised we're hearing that. That's bizarre to me that a government agency representative would say that, because I'm not reading that anywhere at all.
And I
good
know,
luck getting into a doctor anyway at this point.
right. And is there a difference between, I know we can't provide or require a negative COVID test, and can you even get a note that says the employee's released to go back to work in general?
No,
Okay.
the only protocol you should be following at this point that's mandatory is the quarantine or isolation period. And those are specifically designed that if you're isolated or quarantined for the prescribed period, according to the doctors, the virus should have worked itself out of your system and you should not be contagious at the end of the period,
Okay.
unless your symptoms have remained. And you always hear about there's a few cases where someone's illness lasts longer than 10 days and they're maybe, at that point, they're seriously ill, maybe they're in the hospital or they've got lingering symptoms. Well, that's why the rules say at least 10 days, but at least 24 hours since your symptoms have cleared. Clearly, someone could have symptoms that linger past 10 days, in which case they're not coming back to the workplace.
Right.
So it's the government's really just focusing on the time period versus
Okay.
some sort of documentation that clears the person.
All right, good to know. This company has their main branches located in California. They have 2 other branches in Hawaii and Arizona. Is the company required to report positive cases in those Hawaii and Arizona locations or just California?
The way I read the regulations is this just applies to your California workforce. You should
Okay.
check your rules in your other states that you're operating in to see if they have any special rules.
Under the COVID case information, does the county's isolation order apply to people who are only symptomatic and have yet to be tested? If so, then close contacts of a symptomatic person who has not tested positive also need to be excluded from the workplace, ?
Yes, I believe that if I understand the question and the rules correctly, if the person has the symptoms, they should isolate.
Okay.
And I guess the problem we're going to have, of course, is that you can have symptoms of COVID that are also symptoms of other illnesses, like take the flu, right? And we don't know, is the flu, is it COVID? Which one is it? Or neither, right? But we're still doing the isolation anyway to basically to eliminate as much risk of COVID as possible.
Right. A few more. I'm not, obviously we don't have time for all of these, but some of these that Molly and I can answer, we will get back to you guys. So if you don't hear your question, we'll get back to you. But here's another one for critical infrastructure, such as a DoD contractor. Do employees named as a close contact who tested negative and are completely asymptomatic need to stay home for 10 to 14 days?
Go to the California, I'm answering the person, your homework assignment is go to the California Department of Public Health
Okay.
and look at their quarantine guidance, because they're saying that during critical staffing shortage, when there are not enough staff to provide for example, patient care or essential critical infrastructure workers, they're not prohibited from returning after day 7 from the date of the last exposure if they received a negative test. So that's healthcare workers and exposed asymptomatic emergency response and social services workers who face clients in assisted living facilities and child welfare assistance. I haven't read through all of the recent publication to see if outside of healthcare and what I just mentioned, there's also reduced time period rules. You and I, the Mr. or Mrs. Questioner, would be reading through the material together to figure that out. So what I would just do is keep an eye out in the California Department of Public Health website. Are they talking about other critical infrastructure besides the healthcare industries that I just mentioned? See if there's something shorter than the 10 or 14 day period. Because I'm seeing, when I immediately went to the website, there's that 7-day period, but it's referring specifically to healthcare and social services, but not other industries. Okay, what else?
Let's see. If an employee is off work related to COVID, symptoms, quarantine positive, can the employer require the employee use their own PTO to supplement the difference if there is state disability? I know you talked about that a little bit, but I think that was answered yes, that employees could use vacation and that you could require them to use vacation and sick time.
That is not clear from just reading the regulations in and of themselves. And that's, again, this is highly controversial, even the obligation to pay anything.
Right.
But the pay thing, the pay component, let me just refer to it real quickly. Employers may use employer-provided employee sick leave benefits for this purpose and consider benefit payments from public sources, like Molly mentioned, in determining how to maintain earnings, rights, and benefits where permitted by law and not covered by workers' compensation. So what I just read to you is the section where it says you've got to pay workers when they're excluded. It says sick pay. It doesn't say vacation. I would be reluctant, without further guidance, to require people to use vacation time for their exclusion period. Definitely sick pay, but other types of PTO, I'm a little hesitant to give you the green light. That's not clearly stated in the regs.
Okay. Let's just do two more and then we'll, so can Chris go over the employer's responsibility for providing free testing? Again, I think the question here is, are there recommendations? Does the employer reimburse the employee when they get it, or do they have to have it on their site? How do they go about doing that?
Mm-hmm. The regulations aren't giving us guidance on how to implement the testing component. It just says it should be given to the employee free of charge to them. So I think the suggestions you have about making arrangements with a local clinic to provide the testing and then it's charged directly to the employer, or the reimbursement approach would work either way. I think whatever approach you're going to take, have a documented communication with your employees so that they know one way or the other they're going to get it paid for.
Okay, and we'll finish up with this one. As far as the OSHA reporting, is the OSHA log is concerned for reporting the COVID cases, do you have to do that for all employees if they have tested positive for COVID, or only if it's work related? So if they admit, hey, in this example they gave, two of my family members had it and I was at a wedding or a family gathering or something and that's how I got it, does that trigger the OSHA reporting on the OSHA log?
Not necessarily, because if they're, let's say they go to a wedding this weekend and then they call off from work and they were never in the workplace, and there's clear evidence that it's not work related, they weren't in the workplace while they were positive, exposing others, then I think you can clearly conclude this isn't work related. But it gets squishier where someone tests positive and you don't know why or how they got the diagnosis, and that can often be the case.
Right, okay.
So if there's unless there's clear evidence ruling out that it's from the workplace, you should act as if it came from the workplace.
All right. Okay.
Well, thanks everyone, and I appreciate your indulgences. The technology for whatever reason broke down. I don't know why, but thanks for your patience. And
we don't have control over that, right? So thank you very much, Chris. Yeah, and as I said, if the Q&A section with the chat poll, the chat part of it doesn't record, but we will go through the Q&A, make sure everybody got their questions answered. We will send out a copy of the slide presentation. The program is being recorded, so we'll let you know when that's available. Anybody that needs HRCI credits, that will go out as well. And I can't leave without reminding everybody that SDEA's employment law update is January 21 and 22. It's 2 half days or 2 hour-and-a-half days. Chris will be one of the speakers. We'll have Lonnie Zilberman and Dan Eaton as well. And this will probably, it's not going to take over the whole discussion, but I don't see how we can have an employment law update without discussing any of this. So Stay tuned for what happens next. We know that this is ever changing on a day-to-day basis. So give us a call, and Molly and I and the team will do the best we can to answer your questions for what we know today that can change tomorrow. Okay, thank you. Thanks again, Chris. Thank you, everybody. Have a good weekend.